Well, good morning, brethren, and happy Sabbath to you all. It's good to be back up here again. Now, in my last message, we went through the story of Israel during their 11 months based at Mount Sinai. Now, in my message today, we're going to cover the final part of the story of Moses and the Exodus. So previously, we looked at the time of Israel at Mount Sinai, where they spent 11 months. Now today we're going to cover the final part of the story of Moses and the Exodus. Now Moses was one of the greatest leaders in the Bible who, with the help and power of God, led Israel out of Egypt. Now Cecil B. DeMille, in his epic movie The Ten Commandments, took the story of the Exodus up to the golden calf and Moses getting angry and breaking the tablets. Now he then jumps forward to the very end of the Exodus story with Moses on Mount Nebo watching the Israelites head across over the Jordan River. Now there's a whole lot more to the story, to the rest of the story, that Cecil B. DeMille bypassed, including their entire journey from Mount Sinai to Kadesh Barnea, where they ended up wandering for 40 years because of their lack of faith and disobedience. And from there, the journey of a new generation down to Ezion-Geber, and back up past the lands of Edom and Moab before they crossed the Jordan River. Now today we're going to cover those lesser known events of the back part of the Exodus journey, and I hope that they'll become a lot more familiar and clearer to you by the time that I finish my message. Now in the last part of the series we covered the highlights of the book of Leviticus. Now the next book of Moses after Leviticus is the book of Numbers. Now it's given this name because of the census which begins the book. Now at the end of the 40 years of wandering, another census would be taken in Numbers chapter 26. Now the book of Numbers tells the story of the Exodus from near the end of their time at Mount Sinai to the appointment of Joshua and preparations to cross the Jordan River. Now the narrative or story chapters go from chapter 9 through to chapter 27 when Joshua is appointed Moses' leader. Now chapter 1 starts with the first census, then the arrangement of the camp, and then several chapters of laws and duties of the Levites. Now amongst the laws of the first chapters of Numbers in chapter 6 is what is referred to as the priestly blessing or benediction, which reads, "The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace." Now these are very beautiful and very heartwarming words. Now in 1979, two small rolled up silver amulets were excavated in the Valley of Hinnom near Jerusalem with the priestly benediction of Numbers 6, which are now in the Israel Museum. Now the tombs of the amulets were dated back to about 600 BC. Now scrolls were often written and the old ones would be then destroyed. Now the oldest scrolls with parts of the Bible on are the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are dated between 100 and 200 BC. Now these amulets here are the oldest existing copy of any verse in the Bible, engraved nearly 500 years before the Dead Sea Scrolls were copied from older scrolls which are no longer in existence. Now continuing on with our brief overview of the key things in the book of Numbers, in chapter 10 they leave Mount Sinai after being there for 11 months. Then the Israelites cry out for meat and God sends them quail for about a month. Now chapter 12 is Miriam and Aaron opposing Moses. In chapter 13 we read the story of the spies who then get sent into the promised land. And in chapter 14 we read about when the Israelites fear to go into the land that God decrees that their children would only go into the land, would not go into the land, and Israel would wander for 40 years. Now a couple of chapters later, this is going a lot nice. Chapter 16 is Korah's rebellion. And then when we get to chapter 26, they're on the move again, and this is where Moses strikes the rock twice after the Israelites complain and cry out for water. Now in chapter 21, they go around Edom and Moab after being refused permission to travel along the king's highway. Chapters 22 to 24 is the story of Balaam being hired to curse Israel and his oracles. Now in chapter 5 we read about the story of the Moabite and Midianite women tempting the men of Israel to worship Baal with them. And in chapter 27 is when Joshua is appointed Moses' successor. Now there are further chapters which cover laws, offerings, tithing and vows. Reuben and Gad settling east of the Jordan. A list of places on the Exodus journey and boundaries of Israel's inheritance and cities of refuge for the Levites. Now the first encampment after they left Mount Sinai was a journey of 3 days, which was where they complained about the manna and cried out for meat. Now the second camp was Hazeroth, where Miriam and Aaron would murmur against Moses. Now Numbers 33 notes 20 camp locations between Mount Sinai and Ezion-Geber at the top of the Gulf of Aqaba. And it was likely that each of these places is about 2 or 3 days from each other for the Israelites on the move. Now none of these places are known with any certainty, but they are most likely on the regular ancient trade route between Midian and Ezion-Geber. Now the map here shows Glenn Fritz's route for this part of the Exodus route. Now the Israelites have only been travelling for 3 days since they left Mount Sinai when the people begin to murmur at Kibroth Hattaavah, the first of the 20 encampments en route to Ezion-Geber. Now in Numbers 11 we read the story of people crying out for meat. Now it says in verse 4, it speaks of the mixed multitude starting off the murmuring, and then it spreads quickly to the rest of the Israelites where they cry out, "Who will give us meat to eat?" Now back in Exodus 12:38 it says that a mixed multitude went out of Egypt with the Israelites. So there are other foreigners who went with the Israelites who were perhaps fellow slaves in Egypt, and maybe some Egyptians, one of whom we'll see shortly was Moses' first wife. Now some of the mixed multitude may have departed earlier when Israel nearly spent a whole year at Mount Sinai. Now many more of them probably departed at the time that Israel was sentenced to remain in the wilderness for 40 years. And they probably were the ones who shared their stories about the great Red Sea crossing and other miracles that they had seen along the way. Now it is during this event when Moses in exasperation cries out face to face with God, "Why have you afflicted your servant? And why have I not found favour in your sight that you have laid the burden of all these people on me? I am not able to bear all these people alone, because the burden is too heavy for me. If you treat me like this, please kill me here and now." Now Moses really is indulging here in some self-pity and asks God to kill him and put him out of his misery. But God has mercy, knowing that he is human and at the end of his rope with such rebelliousness and lack of faith on the part of the Israelites. Now even Moses' faith is starting to wane, thinking it is his responsibility to go out and find meat for them when providing for them was God's job. Now God then gives him help by giving his Holy Spirit to 70 of the elders to assist him with this burden. Now the next incident we read about in Numbers 12 occurs at Hazeroth, the second of the 20 camps between Mount Sinai and Ezion-Geber. Now if you remember in part 2 we saw that Moses, before he was converted and was still a prince of Egypt, made a political marriage with an Ethiopian princess named Tharbis according to Josephus, though she is not named here in the Bible. Now Moses married Jethro's daughter Zipporah during his 40 years of exile before the Exodus, not thinking he would ever go back to Egypt. Now Now it appears as if Tharbus catches up with Moses at the time of the Exodus and joins the Israelites as part of the mixed multitude that leaves Egypt. Now, seeing Moses has another wife, she probably took a back seat to begin with. Now, I suspect what triggered this incident was that Zipporah died and Tharbus wanted her marital due as Moses' only surviving wife. Now, Moses, being a humble man, probably reasoned that she had such a right. Now, even though they were married before his conversion to God, as far as he was concerned, she was his legal wife. Now, Miriam and Aaron, Miriam in particular, got jealous over a foreign and clearly different woman because of her dark skin having the status of being Moses' wife. So they said, "Has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us also?" Now we know Aaron was Moses' spokesman before God, before the Pharaoh. Now Miriam, perhaps here is referring to the Song of Miriam in Exodus 15, which God may have inspired after the Red Sea crossing. And then we read, "And the Lord heard it. Suddenly the Lord called Aaron and Miriam, and they both went forward. Then he said, 'Hear now my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, will make known myself to him in a vision. I speak to him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. I speak with him face to face, even plainly, and not in dark sayings. And he sees the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses?'" So we see here God's anger is against the way that they arrogantly spoke against his friend Moses. Now, God's view of the marriage is not stated here, so we should be careful not to use this passage to say that God approves of interracial marriage. That might be the case, but this passage is not proof of that, especially when we realise that he married her before he was converted. Now, God here is far more concerned with the way that Moses is being verbally attacked by his sister and brother. Miriam is struck with leprosy, and then Moses intercedes for her, and God heals her, but she has to spend a week outside the camp. Now, Miriam in particular and Aaron got puffed up with pride and jealousy. Now, verse 3 tells us that Moses had the opposite attitude. It reads, "Now the man Moses was very humble, more than all the men who were on the face of the earth." Now, if Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, this seems a very strange thing for Moses to write about himself. Now, translators usually put this verse in brackets. It is very likely an editorial update, quite likely inserted in by Joshua, who also probably added in the section about the death of Moses at the end of the book of Deuteronomy. Now, assuming it was Joshua, he says that Moses was very humble and more than anyone on the earth. Now, this brings us to the 8th lesson that we can learn from the life of Moses. Be humble and meek like Moses. Now, a humble person is lacking in selfishness, pride, envy, and vanity. A humble person is one who doesn't feel superior to others. He realises how insignificant he is without God, that he doesn't have the true wealth of God's character by and of himself. And he realises how much he needs to change and be more like God. Now, we see this displayed all through the life of Moses as described in the Bible. Now, the Israelites continued on, stopping at a number of campsites before reaching Ezion-Geber at the top of the Gulf of Aqaba, before making one much longer move to the wilderness of Zin, as it states in Numbers 33-36. Now, in that verse it says, "the wilderness of Zin, which is Kadesh." Now, when we read the account of the spies going into the promised land, it says, after their journey they came back to the Israelite camp in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. Now, comparing these two verses, we see that Kadesh is in both the wilderness of Zin and also the wilderness of Paran. Now, the wilderness of Zin is believed to be the Nahal, or valley of Zin, not too far from the southwest corner of the Dead Sea. Now, the wilderness of Zin appears to be a smaller part of the much larger wilderness of Paran, which appears to cover most of the land to the south and west of the bottom end of the the Dead Sea, down to the Gulf of Aqaba. Now, Kadesh in other verses is referred to by the longer term Kadesh Barnea. Now, Kadesh means holy, and Barnea is thought to mean place of wandering. So it gets its name from the wandering of the Israelites in that area. Now, here are a few pictures of Nahal Zin, which does have a stream that flows through it, which possibly would dry up in the dry seasons. So they have reached the southern edge of the promised land at Kadesh Barnea. Now, this location of Kadesh was where the spies journeyed from, and also where the Israelites spent 38 of their 40 years of wandering. Now, it lies just south of the biblical Negev, which is the low grassland south of the ascent up to Hebron between Beersheba and Arad. Now, after they arrive at Kadesh in the wilderness of Zin, 12 spies, one each from each of the tribes, are sent out to spy the promised land. Now, over the course of 40 days, they trek all the way up to Lebanon and back. Now, the grapes, the pomegranates and figs are outstanding, but 10 of the spies give a fearful report. Now, there are giants in many of the cities, and they are fortified with very high walls. Now, the people are overwhelmed with fear and decide they actually want to return to Egypt. Can you believe it? And then Joshua and Caleb plead with the people to have courage and believe that God will be with them and help them to conquer the land. Now, instead of seeing reason, they then call out for Joshua and Caleb to be stoned. Now, God's anger is naturally aroused, and he threatens to destroy them and make out of Moses a new nation to take over from them. Now, Moses again intercedes for the people and convinces God to have mercy after being tested by the Israelites for the 10th time. Now, there are 10 recorded rebellions up to this point, but this wouldn't be the last rebellion. Now, God decrees that instead of killing them right then and there, which their rebellion fully deserved, that they will wander for 40 years and not enter the land, with the exception of Joshua and Caleb. Now, God a second time almost killed all the Israelites and started afresh with Moses' family. Now, had he done so, you have to wonder what would have happened to the prophecies regarding Jacob's and family in the end time, especially the prophecies about Ephraim and Manasseh becoming a company of nations and a great nation. Now, Ephraim at least would have continued through Joshua. Now, the people then greatly mourn and confess their sin, but then presumptuously try to attack the Amalekites and the Canaanites themselves without God's blessing, and are defeated. Now, they were beaten back to Hormah, west of Arad, so they probably tried to take on Arad. Now, this brings us to the 9th lesson that we can learn from the life of Moses. Don't grumble and complain against God like the Israelites did, but trust him to provide. Now, the people of Israel didn't seem to notice what God was doing for them, setting them free, making them a nation, giving them a new land, because they were so wrapped up in what God wasn't doing for them. They didn't show respect to God. Rather than politely asking for the things that they lacked, they whined and complained like rebellious, spoiled children. Now, we start to grumble when our attention shifts from what we have to what we don't have. Now, in Philippians 2 verse 14, the Apostle Paul wrote, "Do all things without complaining and disputing." Now, I know myself how easy it is to slip into that grumbling mode whenever a series of inconvenient things happen, especially when I'm working. I find myself from time to time acting as if I'm entitled to not have anything annoying or inconvenient happen to me. Now, God amply demonstrated his capacity to provide for them on the Exodus journey with one miracle after another. Now, that even applied to the little things such as noted in Deuteronomy 29:5, where God said, "And I have led you 40 years in the wilderness. Your clothes have not worn out on you, and your sandals have not worn out on your feet." Now, the Israelites ignored all that evidence when they didn't trust him to provide. Now, when we are in need, we have to remember the previous times that God has come through for us and provided for our needs, and trust him to do so for our current needs. Now, for their rebellious complaining, that generation would be in the wilderness for 40 years, and only their children would enter the promised land. Now, it was easier to take Israel out of Egypt than it was to take Egypt out of Israel. Now, to the new generation, they were told in Deuteronomy 8:2, God led you all the way these 40 years in the wilderness to humble you and test you, to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. Now, the first generation rebelled 10 times by this point. Now, there would be 4 more rebellions to come. There would be Korah's rebellion. They're crying out for water when Moses struck the rock twice. The rebellion at the time Moses made the bronze serpent. And finally, there was the fornication and idolatry with the women of Moab. However, by the time the rebels behind those latter rebellions were chastised and purged, the new generation did at long last remain faithful under Joshua, and even the elders of that new generation who outlived Joshua. Now, this next event in the story of the Exodus journey could have occurred at any time during the 38 years that they were based at Kadesh Barnea. Now, we read in Numbers 16 that about 250 leaders under Korah, a Levite, rebelled against Moses. Now, this greatly angered God, who opened the earth to consume the rebels. Now, when the people afterwards complained to Moses that they'd killed the people of the Lord, God heard it and caused a plague to destroy the people. Now, Moses then asked Aaron to urgently make an atonement for the people with his censer and stand between the living and the dead. And at that point, God stopped the plague after 14,700 people had died. Now, likewise, when it comes to warning our Israelite nations of the coming tribulation and the time of Jacob's trouble, we need to be urgent with that warning message as a church and stand between the spiritual living and the dead. Now, following this incident, God put his stamp of approval on Aaron's family, being the chosen family to be the priests, when he performed a miracle with Aaron's bud and made it to blossom with buds. Now, this would then go into the Ark of the Covenant with the 10 Commandments and the pot of manna. Now, in Numbers 20, we read about the events that occur at the very end of their time at Kadesh and the start of their journey from Kadesh into the Promised Land. Now, in verse 1, we read, "Then the children of Israel, the whole congregation, came into the wilderness of Zin in the first month, and the people stayed in Kadesh, and Miriam died there and was buried there. Now, they left Sinai in the second month, and likely only took a few months, not 11 months, to get to Kadesh." Now, this, based on the context of what happens in the rest of the chapter, is likely referring to the last year of the Exodus journey. Now, Albert Barnes in his commentary states, "During the past 38 years, the congregation had been broken up. No doubt around the tabernacle there had continued an organised camp consisting of the Levites and others. But the mass of the people had been scattered over the face of the wilderness of Paran and led a nomadic life as best suited pasturage of the cattle." End of quote. Now, the reference to the whole congregation coming to the wilderness of Zin and Kadesh is everyone coming together to get ready to leave Kadesh for the Promised Land. And at this time at Kadesh, Miriam dies and she is buried there. Now at the end of the chapter we read how Moses and Aaron and Aaron's son Eleazar went up to Mount Hor in the sight of all the congregation. Now Moses stripped Aaron of his garments and then put them onto Eleazar his son, and Aaron died there on the top of the mountain. Now Eleazar becomes the new high priest, and Moses dies at Mount Hor. Now Mount Hor is usually identified today with a mountain next to Petra called Jebel Nebi Harun. However, this mountain is in Edom, which we read in the same chapter, that they were denied permission to enter. Now George Robinson in a 1908 article identified Jebel Madara to the east of Kadesh and Nahal Zin as Mount Hor, an identification supported by Glenn Fritz in his book The Exodus Mysteries. Now Robinson about this peak wrote, "Few mountains rise so conspicuously from the plains in which they are situated as Jebel Madara, which rears its flat, square head some 600 feet into the air, resembling a white, lofty citadel." End of quote. Now it's quite possibly their move from Kadesh to Mount Hor, which moved the king of Arad to attack the Israelites. Now this time God gave them victory over Arad. Now in between the deaths of Miriam and Aaron, we read that before they left Kadesh that the Israelites complain again of no water. Now God says to Moses to speak to the rock and it will yield water, but out of frustration with the people's ongoing complaints, he strikes the rock twice and God then brought forth water abundantly. Now Albert Barnes in his commentary writes, "The command was speak to the rock." Now the act of smiting, and especially with 2 strokes, indicates violent irritation on the part of Moses, as does also his unseemly mode of addressing the people. "Hear now, ye rebels." The form of the question, "must we?" directs the people not, as ought to have been the case, to God as their deliverer, but to Moses and Aaron personally. In fact, the faithful servant of God, worn out by the reiterated perversities of the people, breaks down, and then in the actual discharge of his duty as God's representative before Israel, he acts unworthily of the great function entrusted to him. Thus Moses did not sanctify God in the eyes of the children of Israel. End of quote. Now God was not happy with Moses not following his instructions. Now as this was something that Moses had done publicly and not in private, God decreed that it would cost him the chance to lead the people all the way into the promised land. Now Deuteronomy 3 verses 23 to 27 we read, "I pleaded with the Lord at that time, saying, I pray, let me cross over and see the good land beyond the Jordan, those pleasant mountains and Lebanon. But the Lord was angry with me on your account and would not listen to me. So the Lord said to me, enough of that. Speak no more to me on this matter. Go up to the top of Pisgah, or Mount Nebo, and lift your eyes toward the west, the north, the south, and the east. Behold it with your eyes, for you shall not cross over the Jordan." Now Moses had persuaded God to change his mind at least a couple of times before, but this time God drew a line. Now this brings us to our 10th lesson that we can learn from the lesson of Moses. Remember, with some sins, that just one mistake can be extremely costly. Now, how often have we seen this with politicians and sports stars and celebrities have a dramatic fall from grace with just one mistake? Sometimes a seemingly small one in a life lived recklessly. Now, at a leadership conference that I was helping out with back in 2016, one of our speakers, Bob Dick, made an interesting distinction between character and integrity. He said that character refers to our overall pattern of behaviour, while integrity involves keeping a good reputation intact by avoiding those type of mistakes which can ruin our reputation despite all the other good things that we have done in our life. Now, integrity comes from the word integer, meaning a whole number. Now, we can lose that wholeness in regards to our reputation with just one foolish mistake. Now, it might be some misstep which exposes an inappropriate relationship or something inappropriate in our employment. Now, there are sins and mistakes which might seem relatively small but can be very costly in life. We have to be very careful about avoiding those types of sins and mistakes. Now, when Moses recalls the story of Edom refusing passage to pass through their land via the king's highway in Deuteronomy 2, we read how God gave land inheritance to each of the peoples of Edom, Moab and Ammon, and that Israel was not to meddle with them. Now, Ammon and Moab were the sons of Lot, Abraham's nephew. Now, despite Lot not being a direct descendant of Abraham, God generously gave their descendants a land inheritance on the eastern side of the Jordan and the Dead Sea. Now, Edom was south and east of the Dead Sea. Moab was much further north. Now, in between the northern half of the Dead Sea and the territory of Ammon was a territory that changed hands a few times. Now, before the Exodus, Moab controlled that area, including the plains of Moab to the east of Jericho. But they were conquered by the Amorites, and King Sihon was its ruler when the Israelites came to it. Now, when he attacked the Israelites, Israel conquered that land, and it was then given to the tribes of Reuben and Gad. Now, these three nations of Edom, Moab and Ammon would later often be under tribute to either Israel and or Judah, which helped to secure the vital trade route of the King's Highway, which went through these three nations. Now, in order to get around Edom, it meant that the Israelites had to go down all the way to Ezion-Geber and back up the highway on the opposite side of the mountains of Edom. Now, this greatly discouraged the people, and along the way down the Arabah Valley, they yet again murmur against God and Moses, disparaging the manna that God had provided for them and complaining about the lack of water, despite God bringing water out of the rock just before they left Kadesh. Now, God then sent fiery serpents among them, those who had rebelled, and which bit and killed many of them. Now, when they come to Moses confessing their sin, Moses went to God and asked for forgiveness. Now, God then asked Moses to make a bronze serpent and set it on a pole, and whoever was bitten would be healed if they looked at it. Now, Jesus referred to this incident in John 3:14 when he said, "And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man also be lifted up." Now, here is the route that they took from Kadesh down to Ezion-Geber, through the mountain pass to the highway on the eastern side of the mountains of Edom. Now, splitting off the King's Highway to the east was the way of the wilderness, which took them around Edom. Now, they then crossed the brook Zered to go around Moab, and then crossed over the Arnon River. Now, when King Sihon, the king of the Amorites, attacked Israel, they conquered all his cities, including Dibon and Sihon's capital, Heshbon. Now, one other Amorite city they likely conquered at that same time was Shittim, where they were based on in the plains of Moab to the east of Jericho. Now, you can see the ruins here of Heshbon and Dibon in the left two photos. Now, the right two photos show the Arnon River and the brook Zered that formed the north and south border of Moab that the Israelites had to cross over as they went up Moab's eastern border. Now, I actually leave for Israel this Wednesday night, joining up with some fellow Aussies and some Americans for a tour of Israel, including a week at a dig at Tel Burna, which is believed to be the Libnah that was conquered by Joshua. Now, after 3 weeks in Israel, us Aussies will spend another week in Jordan, following a fairly similar path to where the Israelites actually travelled. Now, Numbers 21, we are told they continued going north along the King's Highway up towards Bashan. Now, the likely reason God took them that way was to bring about the situation where Israel could take control of the region of Bashan as part of Israel's inheritance. Now, Bashan is today's Golan Heights, which is east of the Sea of Galilee. Now, King Og came to fight Israel with his army. Now, King Og was a remnant of the race of giants who had a bed that was over 13 feet long. Now, Moses then led the Israelites to victory over King Og, and Israel then conquered the land of Bashan. Now, it's not clear who ruled the area on the east of the Jordan, shown here in green, between the Yarmuk River and the Jabbok River, referred to in the Bible as Gilead. It might have been part of Sihon's kingdom, or perhaps Og's kingdom, or shared between the both of them. Now, technically, Moses did get to go to the Promised Land, the land that Israel came to possess. He just wasn't allowed to cross over to the land west of the Jordan River. Now, after they returned southward from Bashan, they camped in the plains of Moab. Now, it is there where Balak, the king of Moab, became terribly afraid of the Israelites, overwhelming them with their great numbers, and sought the services of the infamous soothsayer Balaam to pronounce a curse on Israel. Now, an amazing discovery was made further north of the plains of Moab, at a site east of the Jordan River called Tel Deir Allah. Now, at that location, some inscriptions were found on a plaster wall, which read, "Warnings given by Balaam, the son of Beor, a seer of the gods." Now, this was the same Balaam, the son of Beor, who was hired to bring a curse on Israel. Now, he meets with God and is told that they can't be cursed, and then tells that to Balak. Now, when he tries again and is stopped by an angel that his donkey can see but he can't, he hits the donkey, and the angel spoke to him as if the donkey was speaking. Now, this talking donkey always reminds me of the famous old 60s sitcom Mr. Ed. A horse is a horse, of course, and no one can talk to a horse, of course. That is, of course, unless the horse is the famous Mr. Ed. Now, Balak, king of Moab, is frightened of the Israelites who have camped in the nearby plains of Moab. Now, the Israelites have already passed around his territory and are a fair distance north of his northern border, formed by the Arnon River. Now, they've gone further north to conquer the kingdom of Og, and have travelled back south to the plains of Moab, and he's frightened they will come south again and attack Moab. So he hires Balaam, a sorcerer, to put a curse from the gods on Israel. Now, Balak seemed to know that the strength of Israel was spiritually rooted, and that he had to cut them off from their source of power if they were to be conquered. Now, Balak and Balaam are coming from the south to the north, and he delivers 4 oracles on 3 different mountains. Now, the first is described as a high place of Baal, which is identified as Bamoth Baal. The next mountain is Pisgah, which is equated with Mount Nebo in Deuteronomy 34. Now, from the first 2 peaks, they could only see the southern portion of Israel, who are based at Shittim. Now, the third mountain, where he delivers his 3rd and 4th oracles, is Beth Peor, which was almost due east of Shittim and Jericho. Now, at Beth Peor, Balaam raised his eyes and saw Israel encamped according to their tribes. Now, this time he could see the whole of the massive camp of the Israelites, who would have numbered around 2 million people. Now, here is an aerial view looking east towards the mountains on the east of the Jordan River Valley. Now, the road from Jericho across the plains of Moab went through a site called Tel Hammam, and then up to Beth Peor, and onto Heshbon, where it joined up with the King's Highway. Now, you can see noted here the 3 mountains from which Balaam gave his oracles and tried but failed to curse Israel. Now, notice the valley today called Wadi Musa, that is between Beth Peor and Mount Nebo. Now, this valley called Wadi Musa is the valley that Moses' body was buried according to Deuteronomy 34 and verse 6. Now, Numbers 25:1 tells us that the Israelites were based at Shittim at this particular time. Now, the word Shittim means acacia trees or acacia grove, as is translated in some Bible versions. Now, American archaeologist Joel Kramer identifies the site of Tel Hammam as the site of Shittim. Now, if Shittim was a city and not an area, this is the logical location for it to be on the road from the King's Highway to Jericho. And its large size meant it would have threatened Israel if it were not conquered. Now, Stephen Collins has been leading the most recent excavation of Tel Hammam. Now, he believed it met its end as the result of a meteor exploding over it, and he has proposed that it is the site of Sodom, which God destroyed by fire and brimstone. Now, he dates its destruction to the 1600s BC in the time of the early Hyksos. Now, by the revised chronology that I've discussed in this series, this would be redated to a time after the Exodus, not earlier, to 1850 BC, when the Bible places the destruction of Sodom. Now, this site too is a little north of Jerusalem. And we read in Exodus 16:46 that God places Sodom to the south of Jerusalem, in the opposite direction of Samaria. Now, the bottom right photo here shows the view from Beth Peor looking towards Shittim and the plains of Moab, where the Israelites would have been camped. Now, even though Balaam was told directly by God not to curse Israel, he kept going along with Balak at each location, hoping somehow to curse Israel because of his love for the money being offered to him by Balak. Now, Balaam was like a child who, having once heard the father's answer, will ask again, hoping that the father's will might change. Now, each time that he tries to curse Israel, God's Spirit comes upon him and he ends up blessing Israel instead. Now, God tells him to tell Balak, God is not a man that he should lie, nor a son of man that he should repent. Has he said and will he not do? Or has he spoken and will it not make it good? Now, God here emphasises his faithfulness to be true to his word. Now, we have a similar sort of story to this later in the Bible when Saul tries to kill David. So he has on 3 occasions sends men ahead of him to try and kill David at Ramah, where he was hiding out. But God's Spirit temporarily moves on them to prophesy with the other prophets. Now, in verse 1 of Numbers 24, it says that Balaam did not go as at other times to seek to use sorcery. Now, David Guzik in his commentary says, apparently on the other 2 previous occasions, Balaam tried to bring forth a curse on Israel, but he couldn't. Now he stopped using these false and artificial aids and just let the Lord speak to him. End of quote. Now, since Balak was not going to pay Balaam, Balaam would get back at him with a free prophecy, one that would show just how blessed Israel will be in the latter days. So Balaam says, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, a scepter shall rise out of Israel. Now, Joel Kramer has done an excellent YouTube video on Balaam's star prophecy that I'd highly recommend watching, where he covers the geography that we've gone through here about this story and an explanation of this star prophecy. Now, the him here is not now and not near. Now, this him shall be in the future and come out of Jacob, and from further away than where the Israelites were camped. Now, this him is identified as coming from Jacob and being both a star and a scepter. Now, the star is a symbol for a god. Now, Amos 5:26 speaks of the star of your gods. Now, stars are often used on ancient steles and inscriptions to denote gods or deities, as seen in the top left photo. Now, the scepter is a symbol for a king. So this person coming out of Jacob will be both a god and a king, and this generally is understood to be a reference to Jesus Christ. Now, the use of a star, such as the Star of David, seen in the top right photo here, in a synagogue at Capernaum, appears to come from this messianic prophecy. Now, when Jesus was born, the Magi came from the east, and they probably passed along Beth Peor on their way to Jerusalem. Now, the Gospel account notes that they followed a star, symbolically referring to this prophecy. Now, at the end of the oracle is something I'll cover down the track in lessons from the Judges. It notes here that Amalek was the first amongst the nations, which raises an interesting question. How is it that Amalek is greater than both Egypt and the Mesopotamian kingdoms? Now, the last verse of Numbers 24 says, "So Balaam rose and departed and returned to his place. Balak also went his way." And then the next chapter starts off by saying, "Now Israel remained in Shittim, or Acacia Grove, and the people began to commit harlotry with the women of Moab. They invited the people, meaning the men of Israel, to the sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. So Israel was joined to Baal of Peor, and the anger of the Lord was aroused against Israel." Now, the plan to directly curse Israel by Balaam had come unstuck. Someone, however, thought of a clever plan to get Israel to bring God's own wrath on them by sending in women to seduce the men sexually and to participate with them in Baal worship, which involved ritual prostitution or fornication. Now, the women are described as from both Moab and also being Midianite. Now, Midian was where Moses dwelt in northwest Saudi Arabia, but there was also a large number of Midianites also living with the Moabites. Now, God tells Moses to have the offenders hung, and a plague goes through the camp as punishment. Now, some 24,000 people died in a plague that God brought on them as punishment. And then when a man brazenly brings a Midianite woman in the sight of Moses, Aaron's grandson Phinehas grabs a spear, and then he kills both of them. Now, seeing Phinehas' zeal for not seeing God's law so openly violated led to God stopping the plague, and his zeal for God's justice is then praised by God. Now, at the end of the chapter, God tells Moses, "Harass the Midianites and attack them, for they harassed you with their schemes by which they seduced you in the matter of Peor." Now, the attack on the Midianites in chapter 31, where not a single Israelite man died, would be an example to others who tried such a scheme on Israel. Now, God focuses on the Midianites, and no mention is made of Moab, who are also involved in this scheme. Now, we learn who came up with the clever plan to get Israel to bring God's own wrath on them by sending in women to seduce the men in verse 5 of Numbers 31. It says, "The women were sent in through the counsel of Balaam." Now, in Revelation 2 verse 14, in the letter to the church at Pergamos, it says, "You have there those who hold the doctrine of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the children of Israel, to eat things sacrificed to idols, and to commit sexual immorality." Now, Fred Stoker in his book Hero draws a fascinating parallel between this story and modern America. Now, in trying to weaken America, Satan tried the direct assault militarily in World War II, which proved unsuccessful. So he then resorted to Balaam's successful ploy by raising up someone like Hugh Hefner to seduce America's men with his Playboy magazine and philosophy. Now, following the plague, a second census is taken nearly 40 years after the first census. Now, comparing the numbers with the first census, the total number of Israelite men has gone down slightly to 601,730. Now, some tribes are up a little, while others are down. Now, the most drastic difference is that of the number of Simeonites, known for their fiery temperament, they have dropped 62% to only 22,200 men. Now Moses was not able to cross over the Jordan, and just before he died, he anointed Joshua to be the next leader over Israel. Now in Numbers 27, God tells Moses, "Take Joshua, the son of Nun, with you, a man in whom is the Spirit, and lay your hand on him, and you shall give some of your authority to him, that all the congregation of the children of Israel may be obedient." Now Joshua was Moses' assistant at Mount Sinai and was one of the two spies, along with Caleb, who showed faith and courage and tried to persuade Israel that God would lead them to victory in the Promised Land. Now both Moses and Joshua were judges like the judges which came after them. Now like the judges, the latter kings of Israel, which came after, were under the authority of God, unlike the absolute kings of other nations. Now judges and Israelite kings executed the day-to-day leadership over Israel under God, like a CEO under the board of directors, including military leadership. Now the main difference between a judge and a king was that a king was a hereditary role with a visible dynasty that would follow him. A judge was selected by God as the need arose. Now the leaders of Gad and Reuben were impressed with the lands that they had just taken from the Amorites on the eastern side of the Jordan, and saw that it was a great country for raising cattle and sheep, which they had many flocks of, so they asked if they could settle that area. And after a bit of discussion, Moses agrees to this. Now the last of the 5 books of Moses is the book of Deuteronomy. Now the name comes from the term used for the book in the Greek Septuagint translation, meaning second law or second giving of the law. Now the duet at the start means two, so I'm always puzzled that it's not spelled D-U-E-T rather and D-E-U-T. Now the bulk of the chapters contain laws and statutes. A few chapters contain narrative of the Exodus journey. Now chapters 1 to 3 is a recounting of the Exodus journey from Sinai to the conquest of Bashan. Now chapter 5 is another recording of the Ten Commandments. Now after a number of chapters encouraging Israel to be loyal and faithful to God, chapter 14 repeats the laws of clean and unclean animals. Now in addition to protecting them from problems that come from consuming animals not designed for eating, God told them, "And you shall be holy to me, for I, the Lord, am holy, and have separated you from the peoples, that you should be mine." Now chapters 15 and 16 cover the sabbatical year and the festivals. In chapter 17 there are laws for judges and also laws for any future kings of Israel. Now Moses' prophecy about a great prophet like him, referring to Christ, is given in chapter 18. Now in the next few chapters there are laws about the cities of refuge, welfare, divorce, corporal punishment, first fruits and tithing. And then in chapter 31, Joshua is appointed to follow Moses. And Moses tells him in verse 6, "Be strong and of good courage. Do not fear nor be afraid of them, for the Lord your God, he is the one who goes out with you. He will not leave you nor forsake you." Now Moses said that there would later come a prophet like him. Now Moses spoke for God to the people, but he also gave future prophecies as well, such as his prophecies and blessing on most of the tribes recorded in chapter 33, which are covered on the handout that I gave when we did lessons to Jacob. Now chapter 34 then covers the death of Moses, which was likely written by Joshua after Moses died. Now Deuteronomy 32, God tells Moses to go to Mount Nebo to view the land, and tells him because of his sin at Meribah that he will not cross the Jordan with Israel. Now he then went up to Mount Nebo, where he died at the age of 120 years old. Now it says in Deuteronomy 34 that he was buried in a valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor, but no one knows his grave to this day. Now there is a postscript to Moses' death in the book of Jude, verse 9, where we read, "Yet Michael the archangel, in contending with the devil, when he disputed about the body of Moses, dared not bring against him a reviling accusation, but said, 'The Lord rebuke you.'" Now, David Guzik in his commentary on this verse says, "Some have said that the devil wanted to use Moses' body as an object of worship to lead Israel astray into idolatry. Others have thought that Satan wanted to desecrate the body of Moses." End of quote. So that was the end of the life of one of the greatest servants of God ever, of whom it says here, whom the Lord spoke with face to face. So on that note, let's conclude by summarising the 10 lessons that we've learnt and focused on in the series on Moses and the Exodus. Number 1, don't focus just on sin's short-term benefits. Focus instead on the long-term benefits of obeying God and the evil consequences of sin, like Moses did when he forsook the pleasures of Egypt. 2, choose to act on faith and not fear when you feel insecure. 3, if you're going to lead in the church, you need to be faithfully leading your own family. 4, stand still in your heart, calmly trust him to open up a path out of any seemingly impossible problem, like God did for Israel at the Red Sea. 5, intercede for others with the deep concern that Moses had for Israel. 6, God does sometimes change his mind, so be bold like Moses in your prayers and put forth a persuasive argument with your request to him. 7, worship and obey God in the manner that he tells us to and not in our own way. 8, be humble and meek like Moses was. 9, don't grumble and complain against God like the Israelites did, but trust him to provide for your needs. And 10, remember with some sins that just one mistake can be extremely costly, like the one mistake that cost Moses the chance to cross over the Jordan to that part of the promised land. So let's all strive to live with the humility, obedience, courage and deep love that made Moses such a great man and servant of God. So that completes the story of Moses and the Exodus. Now, upon my return from my trip, I hope to do a 2-part series on the geography of the Holy Land with lots of photos and videos from my big trip to help with understanding the events of the Bible in the geographical context. Thank you.